In 1933, a loaf of white bread that cost 9 cents once had to stretch farther than anyone would have wanted. Meat disappeared from many everyday dinner tables, and in the working American kitchen, she looked at the jar of drippings, the bottle of ketchup, the onion from the backyard, and found a way to put supper between 2 slices of bread. Number 18 sounded like a small gift for children. Number 8 tasted so strange that people today would have to stop for a moment. And number 1 held on to the smell of meat after the last piece of meat was gone. These sandwiches once fed working people, sent children off to school, and kept a little warmth inside the house. If these old kitchens remind you of a hand that once cooked with very little, follow the channel. Tonight, the old recipe box is opened one more time. Pull a chair close to the stove. If the memory of this old kitchen feels familiar to you, subscribe to the channel. 25 sandwiches begin with number 25, when bread and fat were enough for dinner. Before there was the sound of eggs hitting the pan in the kitchen, before a piece of cheese melted on top of bread, many evenings during the Great Depression began with a loaf of white bread placed in the middle of the table and some kind of fat left over in a jar, in a can, or at the bottom of a pan. She understood this well. A poor meal still needed to be set down on the table with care. The knife had to be clean. The slice of bread had to be folded neatly. The children heard the crinkle of the wrapping paper, smelled the faint butter, the sharp onion, the lard, and then sat quietly, as if that supper was still warm enough to hold the whole family through one more night. Number 25. Bread and butter sandwich. 2 slices of white bread lay still on the wooden table, and the dull knife dragged a thin streak of butter so lightly that it almost melted into the inside of the bread. In 1932, in New York, Chicago, and Detroit, white bread cost about 5 to 9 cents a loaf, and butter cost about 28 to 32 cents a pound, so this sandwich often cost only 1 to 2 cents. She cut the bread, touched the knife to the butter, spread it very thin, and then folded the 2 slices together. The layer of butter made the bread softer and more fragrant, helping children feel that between the two slices of bread, there was still a little something saved just for them. In the years from 1932 to 1933, many homes waited a very long time before seeing meat on the table. The small sound of chewing echoed in the dark kitchen. A streak of butter held the evening in place. Number 24. Onion sandwich. The smell of raw onion rose as the blade cut through the white onion, sharp and biting, making the eyes of the person standing at the stove grow a little wet. In 1933, in Iowa, Indiana, and Ohio, white onions cost about 5 cents a pound, or 10 cents for 3 pounds, while white bread was around 5 to 9 cents a loaf. She peeled off the dry skin, sliced the onion into round rings, placed them between 2 slices of bread, and pressed them lightly with the palm of her hand. The sharp taste gave the bread a filling, a smell, and a crunch. The father carried the smell of onion on his breath when he left the house to look for work. The children bit more slowly, but they still finished it. The onion did the heavy work. Number 23. Lard sandwich. A jar of white lard sat beside the stove, its surface smooth and still, but its familiar rich smell pulled the room closer together. In 1933, in Kentucky, Missouri, Arkansas, and urban working-class neighborhoods, lard cost about 8 cents a pound, white bread about 5 to 9 cents a loaf, and salt only a few cents for a small packet. She opened the jar, spread the lard on the bread, sprinkled a few grains of coarse salt over it, and then folded it together. The rich taste, heavy with the smell of pork, spread slowly, holding the eater's stomach through the long afternoon. On farms, lard came from the late fall hog butchering season. In the city, it helped many kitchens keep their strength. Fat kept people standing. Number 22. Bacon grease sandwich. The lid of the tin can opened softly. Inside was cooled bacon grease, still holding the smoky smell of the previous meal. In 1935, in Midwestern farm kitchens, the Ozarks, and Appalachian miners' homes, bacon cost about 22 cents a pound and bread about 9 cents a loaf. She strained the grease through cloth, kept it in a can behind the stove, and spread it on bread when the pantry grew thin. If the grease was still warm, it melted down into the inside of the bread, leaving behind a very faint smoky smell. A pound of bacon disappeared very quickly, but the grease carried the memory of that piece of meat into another meal. The smell of meat stayed behind. When fat had to be divided into tiny streaks, the seasoning bottles on the shelf began to change roles. When condiments had to pretend to be the main meal. There were days when the thing that used to sit at the edge of the plate had to step between two slices of bread. After the smears of butter, lard, and the leftover smell of smoke, the kitchen reached a quieter layer of shortage. On the shelf, there were only a few small bottles left, one yellow jar, one white jar, and a dark red color clinging beneath the neck of a bottle. She looked at them for a long time. Then she pulled the chair closer to the table, opened the bag of old bread, and did what many kitchens of that time once did. She turned the flavor that was left into a meal. Number 21. Bottled ketchup. Sandwich a dark red streak spread into the crumb of dry bread, sweet and sour, slightly sticky, making the old slice suddenly take on the color of a lunch that was still trying. In 1934, in Appalachia, the Deep South, the mining towns of West Virginia, and the tenant farms of Tennessee, bottled ketchup cost about 10 cents a bottle, and bread cost about 5 to 9 cents a loaf, so that sandwich often came in under 2 cents. She opened the bottle, shook it gently so the sauce gathered at the neck of the glass, tipped it down over the bread, and spread it into a thin red layer. Then she folded the two slices together, pressing lightly so the sweet sour taste soaked into the crumb. No meat, no vegetables, no cheese. But the bottled tomato flavor made the bread less hard to swallow, and the child had something clear to taste. Many children carried it to school in a brown paper bag. At lunchtime, the sound of the paper opening was dry and rough in the classroom. The teacher saw the red color on the bread, then turned away very softly, the way adults often did in those days. Seasoning became a poor lunch. If that red color brings back an old paper bag, hold on to that memory for one more moment. Number 20. Mustard sandwich. The smell of yellow mustard rose sharp and pungent when it touched the bread, waking the tip of the tongue before the bite was even taken. In 1933, in East Coast tenements, Chicago boarding houses, and California migrant camps, a jar of yellow mustard could be around 10 cents, while white bread cost about 5 to 9 cents a loaf. She spread the mustard very thin, dragged the knife close to the edge of the bread, pressed the two slices together, and placed it in the hand of the person who needed to eat. The sharp taste covered some of the smell of old bread, giving hunger a clearer edge. That bite was not gentle at all, but it had a snap. It had heat, and it carried a little warmth down the throat. It was the food of days when the cupboard had been scraped down to the bottom. On the wooden table, the small glass bottle stood beside the nearly finished loaf, while the winter window trembled softly as the wind slipped through the cracks in the boards. The sharpness covered the bottom of the cupboard. Anyone who grew up with a kitchen that knew how to save surely understands how deep that pungent taste can sit. Number 19. Mayonnaise sandwich. A jar of mayonnaise sat in the coolest place in the kitchen, the ivory white layer inside holding a light richness amid the slow dripping sound of the icebox. In 1935, in working kitchens across the Carolinas, Georgia, and Alabama, mayonnaise cost about 17 cents a jar, bread cost about 9 cents a loaf, and one jar could stretch across more than 10 sandwiches. She opened the lid, drew the knife through the cool sauce, spread it over soft bread, and sprinkled on a little pepper if there were still a few grains left in the shaker. The sauce clung to the crumb, rich and slightly sour, making the bite less dry and less stiff in the mouth. When she folded the bread together, her fingertips lightly wiped away the sauce that spilled over the edge, careful as if nothing was allowed to be wasted. In the South, this sandwich lived on long after the Great Depression. People still ate it on hot afternoons, when the fan turned slowly on the ceiling, when adults rarely explained why a white jar had once saved so many suppers. A white jar saved supper. Seasonings helped old bread have flavor, but for children, sometimes a little sweetness was what made a poor kitchen feel as if it had a gift. Sweets and witches, children thought were treats. After the bottles of seasoning had already had to stand in for a meal, the poor kitchen still had one gentler way to soothe children. Sweetness. It came in very small amounts, sometimes only a few grains of sugar, a sticky line of syrup on the hand, a thin smear of condensed milk, or the smell of apples cooked for a long time clinging to the curtains. Adults understood the true value of every spoonful of sugar. Children remembered the sounds, the sound of wax paper opening, the sound of teeth touching sugar grains, the sound of a spoon stirring at the bottom of a pot. In those days, a piece of bread with something sweet on it was enough to make a poor afternoon feel a little less cold. Number 18. Sugar sandwich. The sugar grains fell onto the bread with a small, dry sound crackling like tiny crumbs of a gift in a kitchen that had just come through a long day. In 1934, in the working-class neighborhoods of Pennsylvania, Ohio, and the industrial towns of the Midwest, sugar cost about 23 to 25 cents for 5 pounds, bread about 9 cents a loaf, and butter around 32 cents a pound if the family could still afford to buy it. She spread a very thin layer of butter, sprinkled the sugar more generously than usual, then pressed the 2 slices together so the sugar would cling to the inside of the bread. The butter melted slightly, and the sugar stuck together in tiny grains under the teeth. When the child bit down, the sweetness came up very quickly, making an ordinary slice of bread feel like dessert after school. Children back then rarely called this food poor. They remembered the hand that made the sandwich, remembered the crackle of the sugar, remembered the moment they were handed something that tasted happy in a house where people did not say much. Even poverty knew how to give sweetness. If that sound once lived in your family's memory, hold on to it one more time. Number 17. Syrup sandwich. The amber-colored bottle of syrup tipped down toward the slice of bread, the slow thread of syrup stretching out, sticking to the edge of the bread and to a child's fingertips. In 1934, in the tenant farming South, the Ozarks, Missouri, Arkansas, and rural Kentucky, corn syrup cost about 10 cents a bottle. Local sorghum syrup was often cheaper, and bread cost about 9 cents a loaf. She drizzled the syrup over the bread, folded it like a handheld pastry, wrapped it in wax paper, and gave it to the child before they went out to the fields or off to school. The syrup moved, slowly clinging to the inside of the bread and making the fingertips a little sticky. She wiped the edge of the bread with her thumb, then wrapped it tightly so that sweetness could last farther into the morning. The children of tenant farming families needed quick energy before the long walk down the dirt road. A folded slice of bread with syrup was not heavy, but it helped the feet leave the porch a little more lightly in the early morning mist. Sweet syrup fed the morning. Anyone who remembers the smell of syrup on an old sleeve, let that memory stay warm. Number 16. Condensed milk sandwich. Condensed milk flowed slowly like white caramel, thick and heavy, clinging to the bread longer than the cheap jam left in the cupboard. In 1934, in the kitchens of Appalachia, West Virginia, and rural Pennsylvania, sweetened condensed milk cost about 10 cents a can, bread about 9 cents a loaf, and one can had to stretch across many days. She opened the can, used a knife to take a small smear, drew it into a thin line across the slice of bread, and folded it before the sweetness spilled over the edge. The condensed milk clung to the inside of the bread, smooth, fragrant, and deeply sweet. The child held the sandwich with both hands and ate more slowly than usual, because it felt closer to candy than lunch. The mother in that kitchen used very little. One thin line was enough to make the child believe that today the house still had something worth looking forward to, even though the flour bin had grown low and the kitchen shelf was getting bare. One sweet line stretched a long way. If that small sweetness softens your heart, remember the hand that once knew how to divide it so carefully. Number 15, apple butter sandwich. The smell of cinnamon, cloves, and apples cooked for a long time clung to the kitchen, covering the afternoon with a dark kind of warmth. In 1934, in Appalachia, West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, and rural Ohio, fallen apples from the yard were almost free. If they had to be bought, apples could cost about 25 cents for 8 pounds, while sugar cost about 23 cents for 5 pounds. She gathered the fallen apples, cut away the bruised parts, cooked them with sugar and spices, then stirred for hours until the mixture thickened. The wooden spoon moved slowly around the pot, making a heavy, thick sound against the bottom. When the apple butter cooled, she spread it over bread in a glossy brown layer, fragrant with the smell of autumn and strong enough to keep through the cold days. Those apple butter cooking days once drew neighbors close around the large pot. Poor people contributed apples, firewood, and the strength of their hands. Time took the place of cash, and the smell of cinnamon made the kitchen seem larger. Winter still had a little sweetness left. A little sweetness could settle a child's heart, but in a working person's lunch pail, what mattered most was still something that kept them full for a long time. Filling things in the worker. Lunch pail. After the sweet things that settled children's hearts, the kitchen turned back to something heavier, the stomach of a working person. Morning often came early, when the window was still blurred with cold dampness, and the sound of shoes touching the wooden floor sounded dry in the small house. She laid the wrapping paper on the table, opened the metal lunch pail, and looked at what was left from last night. Potatoes, beans, 1 egg. They did not need to look pretty. They needed to sit firmly between 2 slices of bread, enough to follow a person into the factory, out to the train station, down into the mine, or through many hours standing before noisy machines. Number 14, potato sandwich. Early in the morning, the bowl of mashed potatoes from last night had gone cold, and the spoon pushed down into it with a heavy, dense sound, sad like a kitchen not yet fully awake. In 1933, in the lunch pails of workers in Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Detroit, and Chicago, potatoes cost about 17 to 18 cents for 5 to 10 pounds, while white bread was still around 5 to 9 cents a loaf. She mashed the leftover potatoes until they were softer, spread them on bread, sprinkled on a little salt, and wrapped the sandwich tightly in brown paper. If there was a streak of grease left at the bottom of the pan, she pressed the potatoes onto the hot cast iron so the outside edges would firm up, smell better, and gain a little crispness. When she placed it into the lunch pail, the sandwich felt heavy in the hand, like a silent reminder for the long workday ahead. For the man going into the factory or out to the train station, cold potatoes carried the necessary weight. They filled the hollow place in the stomach and helped the feet last longer among whistles, coal smoke, and a shift that stretched on. Last night fed this morning. If a leftover dish once saved a morning in your family, that memory is worth keeping. Number 13, bean sandwich. An opened can of beans sat beside the loaf of bread, the faint, sweet smell and the smell of old metal blending when the spoon touched the bottom of the can. In 1934, in the mining towns of Pennsylvania and West Virginia and the industrial cities of Ohio, canned baked beans cost about 5 to 10 cents a can, and bread cost about 9 cents a loaf. She scooped out the remaining beans, mashed them lightly with the back of the spoon, spread them on bread, and pressed the two slices together so they would hold. The soft beans broke open, a little sweet and a little thick, clinging to the inside of the bread instead of rolling down onto the wrapping paper. She smoothed the edge of the paper, placed the sandwich into the lunch pail, and closed the lid with a small click. One can of beans could pass through 2 meals in a miner's home. It was eaten hot over toast at night, then became a cold lunch the next morning, lying beside a bottle of weak coffee and a shirt that still smelled of coal dust. 1 spoonful of beans held up a work shift. Between 2 slices of bread, she added more strength so her family could make it through the day. Number 12. Egg sandwich. The egg touched the hot pan and gave a soft sizzle, the yolk trembling, warm and yellow, brighter than anything else left in the kitchen. In 1933, in Chicago, St. Louis, Cleveland, and farm towns, eggs cost about 27 cents a dozen, each egg a little over 2 cents, while bread cost about 5 to 9 cents a loaf. She heated a little grease, cracked the egg into the pan, sprinkled it with salt, and placed the egg on the bread while the yolk was still soft. The white edges set, and the yolk broke under the top slice of bread, soaking yellow into the crumb. She wrapped it quickly, because that warmth was precious, and a lunch with an egg always made the lunch pail seem fuller. Homes with chickens in the backyard were often luckier. Even so, each sandwich received only 1 egg, and sometimes 1 egg had to be shared between 2 children, with each half of the sandwich holding a thin part of the yolk. 1 egg, divided carefully. Potatoes, beans, and eggs helped adults get through the work shift. And then summer brought a few brighter colors. Summer, backyard gardens, and cheap fruit after the potatoes, beans, and eggs in the workers' lunch pail. The story steps outside onto the porch for a moment. The light changes color. Heat rises from the dirt yard, tomato leaves rub against each other in the light breeze, and somewhere out on the street, wooden crates of bananas are pulled down from a delivery wagon with that dry, hollow, very familiar knock of working neighborhoods near the port. By the middle of the recipe box, the cards begin to look brighter too. One corner of the paper is marked with a dried smear of peanut butter. One pencil line mentions summer tomatoes. Another card has a yellow stain along the edge, as if it had once sat beside a loaf of bread for too long. She did not call these foods fancy. She only knew that summer could place a little more red and yellow between 2 slices of bread. Number 11. Tomato sandwich. A slice of tomato, still warm from the vine, lay on white bread, its red juice soaking down, sweet and tart, and full of the smell of sunshine from the backyard. In the summer of 1934, in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and the 2 Carolinas, garden tomatoes were almost free, mayonnaise cost about 17 cents a jar, and bread cost about 9 cents a loaf. She picked a ripe tomato, wiped it on the edge of her apron, cut it into thick slices, and sprinkled on a little salt so the red juice would rise. Then she placed the tomato on a slice of bread, spread with mayonnaise, and pressed lightly so the juice soaked into the crumb. The sandwich softened, grew cooler, smelled better, and carried the taste of garden soil and a long noon on the front porch. During the 6 weeks when tomatoes ripened heavily, many families felt as if the table were more generous than it really was. A backyard fence, a few small rows of soil, and 1 tomato vine could make the cupboard look less empty in children's eyes. Summer lay between slices of bread. If you have ever remembered the smell of ripe tomatoes on your hands, that memory is still very warm. Number 10. Banana sandwich. A ripe banana lay beside the loaf of bread, its yellow peel freckled with brown, giving off a soft, sweet smell in the hot noon kitchen. In 1934, in working-class New Orleans, the Gulf ports, and Chicago railroad neighborhoods, bananas cost about 15 cents a dozen, bread cost about 9 cents a loaf, and sugar cost about 23 to 25 cents for 5 pounds if sprinkled on top. She peeled the banana, cut it into thin slices, arranged them evenly on the bread, and pressed lightly so the banana would stick to the crumb. Some homes mashed the banana with a fork, spreading it into a soft layer so one banana could go farther. When it was wrapped, the sweet smell of banana clung to the wax paper, a little starchy, a little fragrant, enough to make the child eat just a bit more slowly. For many children, bananas were one of the few fresh fruits a poor household could still reach. They came from the port, from the delivery wagon, from faraway wooden crates, and then lay quietly inside a school lunch. One banana soothed the stomach. Something that soft could sometimes hold a child through a long school day. Number 9. Peanut butter and banana sandwich. Thick peanut butter clung to the knife, and soft banana lay on top of that spread, sweet, rich, and filling like a quiet calculation. In 1934, in Midwestern school lunches, southern mill towns, and urban relief kitchens, peanut butter cost about 14 to 15 cents for a 1-pound jar, bananas cost about 15 cents a dozen, and bread cost about 9 cents a loaf. She spread the peanut butter all the way to the edge of the bread, arranged the banana slices on top, pressed lightly, and wrapped it in paper. The peanut butter kept the banana from sliding out, while the banana made the thick spread less dry. When the child bit down, the richness clung to the roof of the mouth. The gentle sweetness followed, and the child had a lunch that lasted long enough to get through the final lesson. This sandwich was smart in a very quiet way. It had fat, a little protein, sweetness, and energy. In the recipe box, the card with a smear of peanut butter in the corner seemed to remind you that she always knew how to stretch what little there was. She understood how to hold the banana slices in place. In the next part, the cards begin to grow stranger, with the word pickle, with cheese dream, and with flavors that made bread feel a little less like yesterday. Strange sounding sandwiches, Grandma Knew. We're right. After the red of tomatoes and the yellow of bananas, the recipe box moved on to cards that would make people today pause a little longer. On one corner of the paper, there was a dried smear of peanut butter. One faint pencil line read pickle. Another card read cheese dream, so brief that everyone in that house back then must have understood it on their own. She cooked from what was left on the shelf, from the taste on the tip of the tongue, from the sound of children taking one more bite. Richness needed sourness. Softness needed crunch. A little cheese had to travel farther than its original shape. Number 8. Peanut butter and pickle sandwich. A slice of pickle cracked under the teeth, a small crunch cutting through the thick layer of peanut butter, rich and sticky. In 1934, in church basements in Ohio, Oklahoma, and Missouri, and at Midwestern potlucks, peanut butter cost about 14 to 15 cents for a 1-pound jar, pickles cost about 10 to 15 cents a jar, and bread cost about 9 cents a loaf. She spread peanut butter on the bread, drawing the knife all the way to the edge, then laid slices of pickle on top. She pressed the two slices together, cut the sandwich in half if it was being brought to a potluck, and set it on a paper plate. The richness clung to the mouth first, the salty sourness followed after, and the crunch made the food feel more awake, as if the sandwich knew how to wake itself up. At community potlucks, people needed something that could be shared, something filling, and something strange enough to give the basement table a story to tell. The yellow lights hung low, the folding chairs creaked, and the children stood near the plate of sandwiches longer than the adults realized. Strange, but right in taste. If a flavor once made a family remember it forever, it deserves to be told slowly. Number 7. Pimento cheese sandwich. The bright orange-red spread glowed on soft bread, cool and rich, little sweet, like a spot of color inside a worker's lunch pail. In 1938, in the textile mills of the Carolina Piedmont, the pimento-growing areas of Georgia, and at church suppers, American cheese cost about 21 to 24 cents a pound, Jarred pimentos cost about 10 cents a jar, and mayonnaise cost about 17 cents a jar. She grated the cheese into small shreds, chopped the pimentos, mixed them with mayonnaise, and spread the mixture in a thick layer over the bread. A small block of cheese would disappear quickly if it were cut into slices. When she mixed it into a spread, that orange-red color reached wider, softer, and became easier to divide. The knife moved across the bread with a light, thick sound, leaving behind richness and a little sweet sharpness. Textile workers needed a lunch that could be wrapped, soft, filling, and bright with a bit of color during a shift full of cotton dust. In the steady sound of the machines, a piece of cheese stretched into a spread helped make noon feel a little less pale. One block of cheese went far. She understood that color could sometimes feed the spirit too. Number 6, cheese dream sandwich. The toast gave a small crackle, the thin slice of cheese bubbled on top, and the edges of the bread browned as they gave off a hot, rich smell. In 1934, in working-class apartments in New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago, American cheese cost about 19 to 23 cents a pound, bread cost about 5 to 9 cents a loaf, and each sandwich needed one thin slice of cheese. She placed the bread on a tray, laid a slice of cheese on top, put it into the oven, and watched it by eye. When the cheese puffed slightly, bubbled, and melted down toward the edge of the bread, she pulled the tray out before the crust burned too much. 6 pieces could heat at the same time if the tray was wide enough. The kitchen heard the sound of metal touching the table, smelled the toast rising warm, and heard the children go quiet for a moment as they waited for their share. The name Cheese Dream said plenty. When even one thin slice of cheese could make a small apartment feel warmer, people understood why that hot little dish stayed in memory for so long. One slice of cheese became a dream. After those small dreams, she began using substitutes to build the meal back up, when bread didn't have to be bread anymore. After the strange-sounding foods that somehow tasted right, the kitchen moved into a more skillful part. There, she looked around and used what was left to rebuild the shape of a meal. If there was no loaf of wheat bread, cornmeal would go into the pan. If there were no apples, cinnamon and crackers would call back the smell of pie. If there was no meat, the jar of peanut butter would stand steadily on the shelf, quietly feeding children through lunch. The sound of a spoon touching a bowl, the sound of hot grease in the pan, the sound of a knife scraping around the inside of a jar. Those sounds said that hardship did not only take away choices, it also taught the cook how to remember food with her hands. Number 5, hot water cornbread sandwich. Cornmeal met boiling water and thickened very quickly. Then, when it touched the hot pan, the outside sizzled and broke crisp under the hand. In 1933, in rural southern Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, cornmeal cost about 5 to 6 cents for a small bag, lard cost about 8 cents a pound, and the water came straight from the stove. She mixed the cornmeal with boiling water, added salt, shaped it into small cakes, and fried them in a cast-iron skillet. The hot grease sang around the edges of the cakes, the outside turning golden and growing crisper with each flip. While the cakes were still hot, she split them open and tucked in a little butter, some beans, a few slices of onion, or a spoonful of warm pot liquor. The cornbread became something that could be held, something filling, and something close enough to a sandwich. In many southern kitchens, wheat bread was not always sitting ready on the table. Cornbread was cheaper, more familiar, and carried the smell of the fields, the smell of stove smoke, and the smell of the hands that had shaped it. Cornmeal took the place of the loaf. If you have ever heard cornbread crackle in the pan, that sound is still feeding memory. Number 4, mock apple pie sandwich. The smell of cinnamon and a light tartness rose from a filling that had no apples in it, yet the kitchen still smelled as if it had held on to autumn. In 1936, In West Virginia, Pennsylvania German kitchens, and the Dust Bowl, Ritz crackers had been common since 1934. Sugar cost about 23 cents for 5 pounds, cinnamon cost only a few cents for a small packet, and tart flavor was cheaper than fresh apples out of season. She crushed the crackers into crumbs, cooked them with sugar, cinnamon, and a little tartness, then stirred slowly until the mixture softened like apple filling. The spoon moved around the pot with a steady, thick sound, and the cinnamon steam rose, clinging to the curtains and the cuffs of her sleeves. When the filling thickened, she spread it between 2 slices of bread, letting the children bite into it and recognize the familiar smell of pie. Even though real apples were beyond what the family could buy, this was how they kept the memory of pie when the real ingredients were too far away. In the Dust Bowl, people learned how to rebuild flavor because sometimes the scent of cinnamon was enough to make the house feel less empty. No apples, but the smell of pie remained. A scent that was held on to could soften an entire poor season. Number 3, peanut butter sandwich. The nearly empty jar of peanut butter sat on the table, the glass sides cloudy with knife marks, while the deep roasted smell still clung inside. In 1934, in school lunches, relief kitchens, and working homes across the Midwest and the Northeast, peanut butter cost about 14 to 15 cents for a 1-pound jar. Bread cost about 9 cents a loaf, and 1 jar could stretch across many meals. She spread it thick when the jar was still full, thinner when the bottom began to show. Then used the tip of the knife to scrape every last streak from around the glass. She folded the 2 slices of bread together, pressed lightly so the spread would hold, then wrapped it in paper and placed it in a child's lunch pail. Peanut butter was thick, fragrant, and a little dry on the roof of the mouth, but it stayed in the stomach longer than many sweet foods. For hungry children, the jar of peanut butter could be trusted because it kept well, was full of energy, had a little protein, and needed no icebox. It stood on the shelf like something small but stubborn. The jar ran low, but the knife still scraped. The closer the list gets to the end, the quieter the food becomes, as if between the 2 slices of bread there is almost nothing left but a wish, when only hope and pan gravy were left. The closer the list came to the end, the quieter the kitchen became. The bright colors of tomatoes, bananas, and cheese had already moved into the background. On the table, there was dry bread, an old skillet, a few crumbs in the tablecloth, and the very soft breathing of the adults as they looked into a nearly empty cupboard. She stood there longer than usual. Her hands were still working, but slowly. The knife made a small sound when she set it down. The wrapping paper sounded thin when it opened. Some meals were made from ingredients, and some meals were made from endurance. Number 2, wish sandwich. 2 slices of dry bread were folded together in the quiet kitchen, and the slow sound of chewing rose like the final sound of supper. In 1933, in Harlem, the south side of Chicago, and the camps of the Dust Bowl, bread cost about 5 to 9 cents a loaf, so 2 slices of old bread could cost less than 1 cent. She placed 2 slices of bread on the table, folded them together, then handed them to the person who needed to eat with a very gentle hand. The person receiving that sandwich wished there were something between the 2 pieces of bread, a slice of onion, a streak of grease, a spoonful of beans. Something with smell, with taste, something that could make the mouth forget the emptiness. That day, the kitchen had only bread and silence left. This was the deepest bottom of the list, where every effort at cooking narrowed down into one small gesture. In the weak light, the empty sandwich was still handed over because a hungry stomach still needed something to hold. Between the bread was a wish. If that sentence makes your heart sink, remember that there were once kitchens that still placed hope on the table. Before the final sandwich, there needs to be a moment of quiet. From the thin smear of butter the sharp slice of onion, the sugar and condensed milk, the spoonful of beans, the egg, to the steady layer of peanut butter, every sandwich tried to hold on to something. When that something ran out, people wished. But if there was still brown grease, burnt bits, and the smell of Sunday meat at the bottom of the skillet, she had not left the kitchen yet. Number 1. Bread and meat gravy sandwich. At the bottom of the cast iron skillet, a thin brown layer remained, and when water touched it, the old smell of meat rose warm and deep. In 1934, in Oklahoma, Kansas, the Texas Panhandle, and farm families across the Dust Bowl, the flour used for one small skillet of gravy might cost around 4 to 6 cents. Bread cost about 5 to 9 cents a loaf, and the skillet grease came from Sunday dinner. She scraped up the brown bits with a wooden spoon, sprinkled flour into the grease that was left, stirred slowly until it thickened, then added water to stretch it into a thin gravy. The rising heat carried a delicate smell of meat. She poured the gravy over bread or spooned it between two slices while it was still warm. The inside of the bread soaked up the pale brown color, softened, and the kitchen suddenly felt as if Sunday dinner had not fully gone away. This sandwich stretched a cheap piece of meat for one more day. It held on to the smell, held on to the warmth, held on to the feeling that the house still knew how to cook for its own people. The smell of meat lived one more day. 25 sandwiches have passed by, and the old recipe box is almost closed. 25 sandwiches have passed by, from the working kitchens of New York, Chicago, and Detroit, to the mining country of West Virginia, the Ozarks, Appalachia, and the Dust Bowl. A 9-cent loaf of bread once had to stretch farther than it was able to, but in her hands, every slice still carried the warmth of a home that knew how to keep its people close. The final card was placed back into the wooden box. The words bread and meat gravy, 1934, Dust Bowl had faded, while the cast iron skillet still held the warm brown smell. If one of the foods on this list once sat on your family's table, hold on to that memory a little longer. Maybe between those two slices of bread, you will recognize a kitchen, a hand, or someone who once quietly cooked for you through hard days. If these memories of old kitchens remind you of someone who once quietly cooked for the family through hard days, follow the channel so we can open more recipe boxes that have been sleeping in time. Maybe she never wrote the whole recipe down because she already knew it by heart.